Welcome to Lesson 4, Module 1 within the Attack-Based SOC Assessments training course. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how you can scope an attack-based SOC assessment to focus on the specific parts of attack that are relevant for the SOC you're looking at. This lesson comes in kind of at the end of framing an assessment where you've teed up the assessment, you're ready to go, and you now just need to figure out what parts of attack are really relevant for the SOC that you're working with. Our primary learning objective for this lesson is for you to be able to identify those relevant parts based on the SOC's current status, requirements, and what they're looking for. So suppose you've decided to run an attack-based SOC assessment for a specific organization. You've done all the messaging, you've set expectations, you've totally teed everything up so that you are ready to go. The next stage is to figure out, well, what attack you want to use. Attack has three primary technology domains: ICS, mobile, and of course, enterprise. And when you're running an assessment, it's important for you to figure out just which of these domains you really need to consider. Now, if you're like me and you're focused on enterprise, much like the training is, you can kind of quickly say, well, I'm just going to look at enterprise and make a quick judgment there, and I don't need to consider ICS or mobile. And that's okay, but even then, you run into questions like, which platform do we consider? Certainly, there's a lot of overlap between Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. But when you have cloud, and network in the mix, you kind of get a variety of different postures you might have depending on the environment you're looking at. And just to set an example, here's a notional heat map for an organization that's only using the Linux platform. Here, the heat map shows some decent coverage. There's low, some, and high confidence across each of the tactics, a good amount of high confidence of detection for a variety of techniques, no glaring holes, maybe a little bit, a few more gaps in exfiltration than we'd like to see, but certainly we're seeing representation across the framework that we're looking at. If we were to take that same coverage and then present it with all platforms shown, well, now our coverage posture looks a little bit different. Now we have the reconnaissance and resource development tactics shown, and those just look like gaps. We now have defense evasion and discovery with a lot more gaps shown there as well. And generally, we're painting a picture that technically is the same coverage, but is conflating techniques that don't apply to the domain to techniques that we might have as actual gaps. And so the biggest downside here is that by not scoping accurately, we end up causing confusion with the assessment in general, how we run it, as well as how we present it. So when you're running an attack-based SOC assessment, it's imperative that you only choose the parts of attack that are relevant to the SOC. And there's four key questions you want to ask when doing so. Number one, do they have the technology present in their environment? This is basically saying, do they have mobile? Do they have ICS? Do they have a cloud environment, Linux, Mac OS? By identifying if they have it, you can help see if that technology should be in scope. And another question is, well, okay, if they do have it, are they supposed to be defending it? Are they actually tasked with defending this specific technology? The third question is whether or not they can even potentially see it. You don't want to evaluate an organization that's, say, only looking at the perimeter by focusing specifically on endpoint tactics. And then lastly, the most interesting one is, do they want to assess it? Whenever you're running an attack-based SOC assessment, you need to work with the SOC to make sure what you're doing is in line with what they're looking for. If you're running an assessment for an organization that can see everything across domains and platforms, but they're only interested in their posture for, say, network devices, it doesn't make a ton of sense for you to go outside of that scope and do more of an assessment than you really need to, and then more than what the SOC actually wants. One gotcha when scoping an attack-based SOC assessment is working with the pre-platform. Looking at the two pre-tactics, reconnaissance and resource development, it seems relatively straightforward that these are things that maybe we should include, but when you dive in deeper, sometimes it's a little bit harder to see whether or not these should be included in an attack-based SOC assessment. Resource development in particular is fairly interesting because these are certainly relevant techniques and a relevant tactic, but they're often outside of most SOC scopes. Whether or not an adversary is acquiring infrastructure might not always be visible for the majority of SOCs. Additionally, reconnaissance is also something that can be in scope, but also can be out of scope. It really depends on how the adversary is executing each of the techniques. Generally speaking, though, during a typical attack-based SOC assessment, we tend not to include pre. This isn't a hard rule, but it's how we've tended to do assessments, as well as how we're going to be talking about assessments during this training. So, a few summary notes and takeaways to walk away from this lesson. Number one, include exactly the parts of attack that are relevant to the SOC. It makes the most sense for you as the assessor, as well as the SOC as the one who needs to improve. When scoping which part of attack you should look at, ask four key questions. Number one, is the technology present? Number two, should the SOC defend against it? Number three, can the SOC defend against it? And number four, does the SOC want those techniques to be part of the assessment? Be careful when working with pre. If you're unsure as to whether or not it's in scope, leave it out. Including it if it's not in scope can potentially cause confusion and might send the wrong message for the SOC you're working with. And lastly, for this course, we focus primarily on enterprise, not including the pre techniques.